The wilderness had a way of consuming everything it touched. For a young woman who had once known the comforts of a small town, the vast and unforgiving landscape seemed like an entirely different world. The air was thinner, colder, and everything seemed unfamiliar. Yet this was the life she found herself in, alone and far from the people who once promised to protect her. She had been with a group of settlers, making their way across the rugged land in hopes of finding a new home. It was meant to be an adventure, a fresh start. But as the journey wore on, the hardships of travel and the unforgiving environment took their toll. First, it had been her parents who fell ill, weakened by a disease that spread quickly among the settlers. She had watched helplessly as the life drained from their faces, and soon they were gone. Then the others, who had once been her companions, grew distant. Perhaps they were afraid of the disease, or perhaps they simply saw her as a reminder of the tragedy that had befallen them. When the illness passed, the group made a decision, one that would change the course of her life forever. They would leave her behind. She won't survive on her own, someone had said, but the decision was made. They needed to keep moving forward. The land was vast and the path was treacherous. The weight of their burdens was too much, and the young woman, still in shock from losing her parents, was no longer seen as an asset. She was simply one more casualty of the journey. The settlers left her with what little they could spare, a blanket, some water, and a few days' worth of food. But even that seemed insignificant in the face of the wilderness. She watched as the group disappeared into the distance, the sound of their wagons growing fainter until it was nothing more than an echo. For a while she stood there, frozen. The world around her seemed impossibly large. The towering trees, the wild rivers, the open skies, everything felt so foreign, so far removed from the world she had known. She tried to push away the overwhelming sense of abandonment, but it clung to her like a shadow, darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. The days were long, and the nights colder than she had ever imagined. She walked for hours, not really sure where she was headed. Every step felt heavy, as if the weight of her grief and isolation had taken root in her body. She tried to ration the food they had left her, but it was never enough. Her throat grew dry and her body ached with hunger and exhaustion. She had no skills for surviving in the wilderness. Her life up until now had been that of a small-town girl, accustomed to the comforts of home, warm meals, the company of family, and the safety of the community. But now none of that mattered. The world had changed in an instant, and she was left to navigate it on her own. It wasn't long before the hunger gnawed at her insides, a constant reminder of how little she had. She tried to gather what she could, berries, roots, anything that might offer some sustenance. But the forest seemed to mock her efforts. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into despair. At night she huddled beneath the blanket they had given her, staring up at the stars. The darkness was suffocating, and the cold crept into her bones. She tried to sleep, but the silence was overwhelming. There were no voices, no sounds of life, only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of a wolf. And in the silence the loneliness grew louder. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Why had her family been taken from her? Why had the settlers left her behind? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. Only the cruel reality of her situation. She had to survive, and yet survival felt like an impossible task. It wasn't just the physical struggle that wore her down, it was the emotional toll as well. She had been abandoned by those who had once promised to take care of her. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound, leaving her to face the wilderness without any hope of rescue. She wondered if anyone would ever come looking for her. Would the settlers return, realizing their mistake? Or would she remain alone in the wild, forgotten by everyone? Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, she felt herself growing weaker. The hunger, the cold, and the isolation took their toll. She stumbled through the forest, her body growing frail, but her spirit clung to the faint hope that someone would find her. The nights were the hardest, as the fear of dying alone crept into her thoughts. She had never been one to give up, but in the face of such overwhelming odds, it was hard to see a way forward. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, she heard a noise. It was faint at first, just the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be another settler? Had someone come to find her? She turned, squinting into the fading light, and there, emerging from the shadows, was a man. He was tall, with a rugged appearance, and his clothes were weathered from years of travel through the wilderness. His face was hard, lined with the marks of someone who had lived a life of hardship and survival. The young woman froze, unsure of what to do. Could he be a threat? Or had she finally found someone who could help her? Her mind raced, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak to run, too tired to resist. She stood there silently praying for some sign that this man was not an enemy. He saw her, his eyes scanning her face, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You're not from around here, are you?" She shook her head, too exhausted to speak. "I've been watching you for a while," he continued. "It's not safe out here alone. What happened to you?" She didn't know how to answer. She didn't want to tell him about the settlers, about being left behind, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. But there was no point in hiding the truth. "They left me behind," she whispered. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to survive." The man regarded her silently for a moment, his eyes unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he extended his hand. "Come with me. I can help you." The girl hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. But in that moment, with the weight of her hunger and exhaustion pressing down on her, she knew she had no choice. She had to take the risk, had to trust that this man would not do her harm. And so, with a trembling hand, she took his. The man led her through the forest, moving with the ease of someone who had spent years in the wilderness. His steps were sure and confident, and though she was exhausted, she tried her best to keep up. Her body ached from hunger and fatigue, but there was something about the way he moved that gave her a glimmer of hope. She followed him in silence, her mind still racing from everything that had happened. The emptiness she had felt after the settlers left, the crushing loneliness that had nearly consumed her. It all seemed so far away now. In his presence, she found a strange sense of safety, even if she didn't fully understand who this man was or what he wanted from her. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing. The man stopped and turned to her, his eyes scanning her face. "You must be hungry," he said quietly. She nodded, too weak to speak. Her throat was dry and her stomach felt like it might cave in from hunger. Without another word, he moved toward a nearby tree and knelt down to gather some kind of root. He worked quickly, digging into the earth with the sharp edge of a small knife he carried. When he had gathered enough, he stood and held the roots out to her. "Eat," he instructed gently. "They're safe. They'll help you regain your strength." She took the roots hesitantly, unsure if she could trust his words. But the hunger inside her was too great. She bit into the root, its earthy flavor filling her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was enough to give her the strength to continue. After they ate, the man made a small fire in the clearing. The warmth of the flames was a relief, and for a moment she let herself relax. She watched as the fire flickered and danced, casting shadows around them. The man didn't speak much as they sat there, but she noticed how his eyes always scanned their surroundings, alert and aware of everything around him. She realized that he was constantly on guard, as if the wilderness itself could turn against them at any moment. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still weak. "To my camp," he replied simply. "It's not far from here. You'll be safe there." The thought of safety was a comfort, but there was still so much she didn't understand. Who was this man? Why had he chosen to help her? He didn't seem like the type to simply offer his kindness to anyone, especially a stranger like her. She wanted to ask more questions, but the exhaustion from the journey and the toll of the last few weeks weighed heavily on her. She yawned, her eyelids growing heavy. "You should rest," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. "You'll feel better in the morning." She nodded, grateful for his concern, even though she wasn't sure she understood it. As he set up a small shelter nearby, she curled up by the fire, trying to find some comfort in the warmth. The crackling sound of the flames filled the silence, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to close her eyes and drift into a fitful sleep. When she woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the clearing. The man was already awake, tending to the fire and preparing something to eat. The scent of cooked meat wafted through the air, making her stomach growl. He turned to her as she stirred. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Better," she replied, sitting up. "Thank you." He nodded but didn't say anything. Instead, he handed her a small portion of the meat he had cooked. It was tough, but it was food, and it tasted like the first real meal she had had in weeks. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, grateful for the sustenance. After breakfast, the man stood up and began to pack their things. "We'll head to my camp today," he said. "It's not far." She followed him once again, her legs still shaky from the long journey. The forest was quieter now, the early morning stillness wrapping around them. As they walked, the man spoke a little more, telling her about the land they were traveling through. "This place is harsh," he said. "It takes a certain kind of person to survive here." "You can't be soft, or you won't make it?" She listened closely, trying to absorb what he was saying. She had never thought of herself as strong. Back home, she had been protected, sheltered from the roughness of the world. But now she had no choice but to learn. As they traveled deeper into the woods, the terrain grew more rugged. The path became less clear, and the man had to lead her over rocks and through dense thickets. He moved with ease, his eyes always scanning for any signs of danger while she struggled to keep up. After a few more hours of walking, they arrived at his camp. It was nestled in a small valley, surrounded by tall trees and a nearby stream. The camp was simple, with a fire pit in the center and a small shelter made of branches and animal hides. "This is home for now," the man said, gesturing to the camp. She looked around, taking in the starkness of the place. It was far from the comfort of the life she had known, but it felt oddly peaceful. The sound of the water flowing nearby and the rustling of the leaves in the trees gave the camp a quiet, serene feeling. The man set to work gathering firewood and preparing for the night. She stood there, unsure of what to do, but he quickly put her to work as well. "You'll need to learn how to survive here," he said. "I can teach you, but it won't be easy. It's not like home." She nodded, her heart heavy with the realization that this was her life now. She had no choice but to adapt, to learn how to survive in a world that was completely different from anything she had ever known. Over the next few days, the man taught her how to hunt, how to gather food, and how to build a shelter. It was hard work, and there were times when she felt like giving up. Her body ached and she was constantly tired, but the man never showed any sign of stopping. He was relentless in his teaching, pushing her to her limits. At night, they sat by the fire, and he would tell her stories of the wilderness. His stories were filled with danger and survival, of creatures that roamed the land and men who had tried to make a life in these unforgiving places. There were no grand tales of heroism or glory. His stories were raw, filled with the reality of living in a world that demanded everything from those who dared to survive. As the days turned into weeks, the girl began to grow stronger. Her body was leaner, more accustomed to the harsh conditions of the wilderness. She had learned how to track animals, how to build a fire without matches, and how to navigate the forest without losing her way. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. She had also learned more about the man. He wasn't just a stranger who had come to her aid. He was a man who had spent years living alone in the wild, far from civilization. He had no need for company, no desire for friendship. The wilderness was his only companion, and it was a companion that could be both cruel and kind. But as she spent more time with him, she began to see something else in him, a quiet, unspoken understanding. He never judged her for the life she had left behind, nor did he ask her to explain why she was here. It was as if he understood that the wilderness didn't care about who you were or where you came from. It only cared about whether you could survive. As the weeks passed, she began to feel a sense of belonging in this new life. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had been given, and in some strange way, it felt like she was beginning to find her place in the world again. But even as she grew stronger, she knew that survival in the wilderness was never guaranteed. Every day brought new challenges, and she couldn't afford to become complacent. She had to keep learning, keep adapting, and keep surviving. And through it all, the man remained a constant presence. He had become more than just a guide or protector. In the quiet moments when they sat by the fire or worked together in silence, she felt an unspoken connection between them, one forged in the harshness of the wilderness. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the settlers had left her behind, she felt like she might have a chance at survival, and that, she realized, was all she could ask for. The days grew warmer as the seasons slowly shifted, and the girl felt a change within herself as well. She had come a long way since the man had found her in the wilderness. Her body was stronger, her instincts sharper, and her mind more attuned to the rhythm of the forest around her. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a life she was beginning to understand and in some ways appreciate. She had learned how to survive, not just by following the man's teachings, but by trusting her own senses. Each day she became more aware of the sounds and sights of the wilderness. The way the trees creaked and the wind whispered through the leaves, the scent of the earth after a rainstorm, the tracks of animals that could be either prey or danger. She had learned to read these signs, and in doing so she had learned to read herself too. Yet despite the progress she had made, there were still moments when doubt crept into her heart. She had been left to die by the settlers, abandoned by the very people who had promised to care for her. That feeling of betrayal never fully disappeared. It lingered in the quiet moments, especially during the nights when the fire flickered and cast long shadows around the camp. One evening, as the man was preparing a trap to catch game, the girl sat by the fire staring into the flames. The crackling sound was comforting, but it didn't drown out the thoughts swirling in her mind. She wondered if she would ever find peace, if she would ever truly belong. She had come to rely on the man, to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. But there were still questions she didn't have answers to. About him, about herself, and about the world they were both living in. Her thoughts were interrupted by the man's voice. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his tone quiet as he sat down beside her. "Miss what?" she asked, not looking up from the fire. "The world you left behind," he said. "The one before the wilderness. Do you ever wish you could go back?" For a moment, she didn't answer. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time. The world before this life felt so distant now, like a dream that had faded into nothing. She had been a different person then, someone who believed in the safety of others, in the kindness of the world. But that person was gone now, replaced by the girl who knew the wilderness would take what it wanted without apology. "I don't know," she said finally. "It feels like it was someone else's life, not mine, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had been with people who cared." The man nodded, but he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he watched the fire for a while as if thinking about her words. "It's not easy what you've been through," he said after a long pause. "But I've seen people break in this world. The wilderness doesn't care if you were rich or poor, kind or cruel. It just takes, and it tests you. But there's strength in surviving it. I think you found that strength in yourself." She looked at him, surprised by his words. "You think I've found it?" He nodded. "I know it. I've watched you. You've come farther than most would in your place. You're not the same person you were when I found you. You've changed." She didn't know how to respond. The man had a way of seeing things clearly, even when she couldn't. She wondered if he truly understood what she had gone through. Maybe he did in his own way. The wilderness had shaped him into someone who could survive on his own. But it had also hardened him. She could see it in his eyes, the same weariness that she sometimes felt when she looked into the still endless horizon. It was a weariness that came from living outside the world that once seemed so safe and certain. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said softly, breaking the silence. The man's eyes flicked toward her, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't one for many words, especially not ones that would make him seem vulnerable. But there was something in the way he looked at her that told her he understood. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice low. "You did all the hard work. I just showed you how to survive. The rest was all you." She nodded, unsure of what to say next. She didn't know if she truly believed him, but she had come to trust his words. And perhaps in the end it didn't matter if she believed it fully. What mattered was that she had survived. She had fought to live, and in the process she had discovered something about herself that she never expected to find. As the fire burned down, the man stood and stretched. "We'll need to move on tomorrow," he said, his voice more matter-of-fact now. "The game is getting scarce around here. We'll head north." She felt a twinge of unease. She had grown used to this place, to the quiet rhythms of life in the camp. Moving on meant leaving, behind the comfort she had found here. But she knew he was right. The wilderness didn't allow for complacency. You had to keep moving, always searching for the next place to survive. The following morning, they packed their things and began their journey north. The air was crisp and the trees stood tall and still as they walked through the dense forest. The man led the way, his eyes sharp and alert, while she followed closely behind, her senses heightened. The further they traveled, the more the landscape changed. The trees grew sparser, and the terrain became more rugged, with jagged rocks and steep inclines. The path was difficult, but they didn't stop. After several days of traveling, they reached a valley that the man had described as a good place to set up camp. The land was less wild here, more open, with a stream running through the center. It was a place that seemed peaceful, almost like a reprieve from the harshness of the journey. As they settled in, the girl felt a sense of relief. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. The wilderness had been testing her, but now, in this quiet valley, it felt like she had found a small refuge. She spent the next few days gathering food, setting traps, and building their shelter. The work was familiar now, and she did it without thinking. The sense of belonging she had been searching for slowly started to take root in her heart. But even in the peace of this new camp, something inside her remained unsettled. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much she didn't understand about this life she was living, about the man she was with, about the world outside the valley. There were moments when she caught herself wondering if she could ever truly feel like she belonged here, in this harsh and wild place. But as the days passed, those thoughts became quieter. She had learned to live in the moment, to focus on what was in front of her. The wilderness had a way of forcing you to do that. It didn't allow for distractions. If you didn't pay attention to the present, you didn't survive. And so she focused on surviving, on adapting to the rhythms of the wilderness, on learning more each day, on finding strength where she thought none existed. The future was still uncertain, but for now, in this moment, she had found a kind of peace. The days in the valley grew longer, and with each passing week, the girl felt herself becoming more and more a part of the wilderness. It was no longer a foreign place, but something she had come to know, its quiet, its challenges, and its rhythms. She had learned to trust the land, to listen to the whispers of the trees, and to understand the way the wind spoke to her. But even as she grew more comfortable, something in the back of her mind always reminded her of the world she had left behind. There was still that lingering sense of abandonment, that feeling of being forgotten by everyone. She could feel it in the quiet moments, in the nights when the fire burned low and the stars stretched endlessly above her. Those moments when she was alone with her thoughts, she wondered whether she would ever truly escape the shadow of the past. The man, too, seemed distant at times, lost in his own thoughts. His presence was always there, solid and steady, but he rarely spoke about himself or his past. She had learned some things over the months. He had lived in the wilderness for years, living a life that few people could understand. He had no family, no connections to the world outside. He had chosen this life not out of necessity, but out of a quiet, unspoken need for solitude. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of purple and the first stars began to appear, the girl sat by the fire, absently stirring the pot of stew that bubbled over the flames. The man had gone out to set more traps, and she had been left to tend to the camp. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made her feel safe but also restless. She hadn't realized how much she missed conversation, how much she longed for the sound of another human voice that wasn't just the man's steady instructions. As she sat, the firelight casting long shadows across the camp, she thought about everything that had happened. She thought about the settlers who had abandoned her, about the sickness that had taken her family, and about the loneliness she had felt in the days after. It had been hard to accept that there was no going back, that the life she had known, her home, her family, her future, was gone. But now, as the fire crackled, she realized that she had come a long way since those first dark days. She had learned how to survive, how to live in the wilderness, and how to depend on herself. The man had shown her how to use a knife, how to track animals, and how to find shelter. He had taught her how to make fire and how to read the signs of the land. But more than that, he had shown her what it meant to keep moving forward, to keep going even when everything around you seemed uncertain. She felt the shift within herself, the change that had taken root in her heart. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been abandoned by the settlers. She was stronger now, more capable and more aware of the person she had become. The wilderness had shaped her, forced her to adapt, but it had also given her something she hadn't realized she needed, a purpose. When the man returned that evening, he noticed the change in her. There was a calmness to her now, an acceptance in the way she moved and spoke. She no longer hesitated or looked back toward the past. She was here in this moment, and for the first time, she realized that it was enough. After they ate, the man spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You've come a long way," he said, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "When I found you, you were barely able to walk. Now you're a different person." She nodded, not sure how to respond. It was true, she felt like a different person, like someone who had been remade by the wilderness. "I owe you a lot," she said quietly. The man looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to speak further. "I didn't do anything," he said at last. "You did all the work. All I did was show you the way. The rest was up to you." His words were simple, but they carried weight. She realized that he didn't believe in easy answers, in heroism, or in grand gestures. For him, survival was about practical things, about getting up each day and doing what needed to be done. But she could see now that there was something more in him, something beneath the rough exterior that spoke of a deep understanding of the world. The next few days were filled with the usual tasks: setting traps, gathering food, and maintaining the shelter. But there was a quiet shift in their routine. They began to work together more fluidly, each knowing what the other needed without having to speak. There was a sense of unspoken understanding between them now, a partnership forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. One morning, as they sat by the stream, the girl asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Why do you live like this?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Why choose the wilderness over everything else?" The man paused, looking out across the water for a long time before answering. "I didn't choose it," he said finally. "It chose me. I came out here once looking for something. I don't know what. Peace, maybe, or maybe just a way to escape. But once I was here, I realized that the wilderness doesn't let you go easily. It takes everything you have, and it forces you to face the parts of yourself you'd rather not see." She didn't speak for a moment, letting his words sink in. She had never thought of it that way, that the wilderness could be something more than just a place to survive, that it could be something that demanded something deeper from you. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "Sometimes I think about the world I left behind, about the people I left behind. But then I remember what it's like out here. I remember the silence, the way the trees move in the wind, the feeling of being alone with yourself. Out here, there's no pretending. No one expects anything from you. It's just you and the land." The girl didn't know how to respond. She didn't fully understand his words, but she knew that something about them resonated within her. She had never thought about the wilderness like that. She had only ever seen it as something to survive, something that could take everything from her. But maybe there was more to it. Maybe it could give her something too. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. They worked together, ate together, and shared quiet moments by the fire. There was an ease to their relationship now, a sense of trust that had developed over time. They no longer needed to speak constantly. There was comfort in the silence, in the shared understanding that had grown between them. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together by the fire. The man was sharpening his knife, his movements precise and methodical. The girl was watching the flames, her thoughts far away. "You're ready," the man said suddenly, breaking the silence. She looked up at him, surprised. "Ready for what?" "To leave the valley," he said. "We've stayed here long enough. It's time to move on." The girl's heart skipped a beat. She had grown comfortable in the valley. It had become a safe haven, a place where she could let her guard down. But she knew he was right. The wilderness didn't allow for complacency. You had to keep moving, always looking for the next place to survive. "I'm ready," she said quietly, though part of her hesitated. She didn't want to leave this place behind, but she knew that survival meant pushing forward, never standing still. The man nodded, and together they began to pack up their camp. They would leave the valley behind and continue their journey through the wilderness, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing that they would face it together. The wilderness had shaped her, had made her stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined. And now, as they moved forward, she realized that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. The journey through the wilderness had been long, and every day had brought new challenges. But now, after so many months, the girl felt as though the land had become a part of her. She had learned the rhythms of the forest, the language of the wind, and the patterns of the animals. She no longer feared the unknown. She had become one with the wilderness, shaped by it, and in turn, shaped by her experiences. The man had remained a constant in her life, a silent presence, and yet a guide, someone who understood the land in a way that few could. They had shared everything: the harshest days of hunger, the nights under the stars, the quiet moments by the fire, and the difficult decisions that came with living in a world so unforgiving. Together they had forged a life, built from nothing but the will to survive. But even in the comfort of this shared understanding, there were still moments of uncertainty. The girl had begun to wonder if there was more to life than just surviving, if there was a world beyond the wilderness that she could ever be a part of again. She had long since accepted that her old life was gone, but there were moments when she allowed herself to dream of something else, something more. She had learned how to be strong, but what if strength was only part of the answer? What if there was more to living than simply enduring the trials of the land? One evening, as the fire crackled and the darkness of the night surrounded them, the girl found herself sitting next to the man. They had made camp in a quiet glade by a stream, the sound of the water blending with the rustling of the leaves. It was peaceful, but she could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing against her chest. The man was sharpening his knife, his focus unbroken by the silence between them. She had learned that he rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were always measured, always deliberate. She could feel that he understood her more than she realized, and perhaps that was why they had formed such a strong bond. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavy with unsaid things, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was the beginning of something that would change everything. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke. "Do you ever think about the world beyond this place?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The man stopped sharpening his knife, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then his eyes met hers, and she saw something in them, a flicker of recognition, as though her question had touched on something deep within him. "I've thought about it," he said slowly. "But the world beyond is a place I don't belong anymore. I've been out here too long. This is my life now." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. She had watched him, seen the way he had built his life in the wilderness, how it had shaped him into someone who no longer belonged to the world they had both once known. But as she sat there watching the fire flicker in the night, she realized something. She didn't belong there either. Not fully, not in the way she had before. She had found strength in the wilderness. It had made her capable, independent, and resilient. But it had also made her realize that survival wasn't enough. She had been running from the past for so long, hiding in the isolation of the forest, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live, to connect with others, to build something that lasted. But how could she go back to the world she had left behind, the world that had abandoned her, that had given up on her when she needed it most? The idea of returning to that life felt impossible, as if it had slipped through her fingers the moment she was left behind by the settlers. She turned to the man, the weight of her thoughts heavy on her chest. "I don't know if I can go back to what I was," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The world that I knew, it's gone. I can't just pick up where I left off. I'm not that person anymore." The man's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You're not the same person, but that doesn't mean you can't go forward. You don't have to be who you were. You've become someone else, someone stronger, someone who can survive, and that's something the world out there will see." She didn't know if she believed him, but his words stirred something inside her. He was right in one sense. She wasn't the same person. The wilderness had changed her. She had learned things about herself that she never could have imagined. She had found strength in the most unlikely of places, and perhaps that was enough to carry her forward. But the question remained, what was she going to do with that strength? As the fire burned low, the girl found herself lost in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness was both a sanctuary and a prison. It had given her everything she needed to survive, but it had also isolated her from the world. She wasn't sure if she could stay here forever, if this life would always be enough, and yet the thought of leaving the man, of facing the unknown again, filled her with a sense of dread. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The man seemed to sense her unease, and for the first time in a long while he spoke with something resembling tenderness. "If you want to leave, you can," he said. "If you want to go back to the world you came from, you don't have to stay here. But if you decide to leave, you'll have to go with everything you've learned. You'll have to carry it with you." She looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had shown her how to survive, how to live in this world. But more than that, he had shown her that it was possible to move forward, to find a way to live again. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply offered her the chance to choose. She didn't know what her choice would be, but she knew that it was hers to make. The wilderness had shaped her, but it was time for her to decide what kind of life she wanted to lead. I don't know if I can go back, she said softly, but I also don't know if I can stay here forever. The man nodded as though he had expected this answer. Then you have to decide for yourself. The wilderness will always be here, but the world is a big place. You don't have to live in either place forever. You can make your own path. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. The future seemed so uncertain, and yet there was something liberating about that uncertainty. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to move forward, to trust that the strength she had found within herself was enough to guide her. As the night grew colder, the man stood and stretched. He looked at her one last time before turning toward the edge of the camp. We'll leave at first light, he said. Where we go from here is up to you. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she would face it with the strength she had earned. She would no longer be a victim of the world, but an active participant in it. The wilderness had been her teacher, but now she would take what she had learned and build her own life. It was time to move forward. The first light of morning was soft, painting the sky with delicate hues of orange and pink. The girl sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and sway, her thoughts still heavy from the night before. It had been a quiet, restless night. The conversation with the man, though brief, had opened something inside her. A realization that the life she had come to know in the wilderness was only part of the story. There was a world beyond it, a world she had once been a part of, but now it felt like a distant memory. She had spent so much time adapting to this harsh, wild place that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream of something more. Now, though, as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, she found herself standing at a crossroads. She had learned how to survive, how to navigate the wilderness, but could she ever truly return to a life beyond this? Was she ready to face a world that had abandoned her so easily? The man had given her a choice. He hadn't told her what to do, hadn't tried to push her toward one path or the other. Instead, he had let her decide, and that perhaps was the hardest part. The decision now rested in her hands, and she wasn't sure what was the right choice. As the man packed up their belongings and prepared to leave the camp, the girl stood up slowly, her body stiff from the night's sleep. Her muscles were sore from the journey they had taken, but they were stronger now. She had learned how to move through the wilderness with purpose, how to track the smallest signs of movement, how to listen to the wind and the rustling of leaves. She was no longer the same person who had been left behind by the settlers. The wilderness had shaped her, but it hadn't defined her, not entirely. The man glanced over at her as he secured his pack. His face was unreadable as usual, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel as though he could sense her inner turmoil. He had lived in silence for so long, but there was a quiet understanding between them now, a silent bond forged through months of survival in this unforgiving world. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. She hesitated, feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready. There were so many unknowns. But at the same time, the desire to move forward, to face what lay ahead, grew stronger within her. She had learned to trust herself in the wilderness. It was time to trust herself beyond it. "I'm ready," she said softly. With a nod, the man slung his pack over his shoulder and started down the familiar path. She followed, her feet moving with a purpose, though her mind was still uncertain. The journey ahead would be different. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had been. The wilderness had taught her everything she needed to survive, but now it was time to see if she could thrive. As they walked through the forest, the world felt different. The air was fresher, the trees taller, and the land more alive. They had walked this path before, but today it felt like they were walking into something new, something unknown. The man was quiet as they walked, his eyes scanning the landscape, ever watchful. She had come to rely on his silence. It was as though he understood the power of unspoken words. He didn't need to fill the air with chatter. His presence was enough. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss as they moved further away from the valley that had been their home for so long. The quiet had been comforting, and now it was being replaced by the unknown. "How long will it take to get there?" she asked, breaking the silence. The man glanced at her but didn't answer immediately. "Depends on how far we need to go," he said after a moment. "Could be days. Could be weeks. Where are we going exactly?" she asked, still unsure of what lay ahead. He paused, looking at her with a slight frown as though he had expected the question. "You'll see," he said simply. "There's a place I know. A safe place." She didn't ask further questions. She had learned not to press him for answers. The man was a man of few words, and there was something comforting in his quiet confidence. But as they continued their journey, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that the time had come for her to make a decision, not just for her survival, but for her future. The days passed slowly as they traveled through the dense forest, over rocky hills and along winding rivers. The world was vast, and it felt as though they were alone in it, the weight of the landscape pressing down on them. There were moments when she felt a deep sense of peace, when the solitude of the wilderness seemed to hold them in a gentle embrace. And then there were moments when the silence was suffocating, when the weight of her thoughts grew too heavy to bear. As they walked, she noticed the subtle changes in the landscape. The trees were no longer as dense, the forest opening up into broader, more open spaces. The sun filtered through the branches in a way that it hadn't before, casting long shadows across the ground. They were moving out of the wilderness they had known and into something else. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the man stopped and turned to her. His face was shadowed, but there was something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "This is it," he said, his voice low. She looked around, not sure what he meant. All she saw was an open field, the soft glow of twilight stretching out before them. But then she noticed the faint outline of a distant structure, small but distinct. It was a cabin, nestled in the trees at the edge of the field. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "A place where you can rest," he said. "A place where you can decide what comes next." The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what he was saying. This was the place he had spoken of, the safe place he had promised. It wasn't much, but it was a place where she could make a choice, where she could decide what the future held. They approached the cabin slowly, the silence between them stretching out. When they reached it, the man set down his pack and walked toward the door, pushing it open with a creak. Inside, the cabin was simple, a small fireplace, a few pieces of furniture, and a bed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Stay here for a while," he said, turning to her. "Take your time. Think about what you want." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The wilderness had given her everything she needed to survive, but now it was time for her to decide what she wanted. She could stay here in this quiet place and live a life of solitude, or she could leave, face the world she had once known, and build something new. The man stepped back outside, leaving her to her thoughts. As the door closed behind him, she stood in the small room, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. What was she going to do? Could she ever truly leave the wilderness behind? Or had it become a part of her, something she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried? As the fire crackled in the hearth, the girl sat down on the bed, her mind racing. There were no easy answers, no clear path. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the peace of knowing that the choice was hers.